forward. Awesome. Hello, folks. Nice to see so many people signing in. Great. All over the place. Lots of names. Yay. Good to see you all. I will probably wait a few more minutes, give people a chance to log on. Uh, but just to let you know, and I'm sure I'll say this again, we'll do questions via either the chat function or the Q&A. You can actually ask them in either location. And so if you haven't done Zoom before, which you probably have, but if you haven't, if you scroll all the way down, a menu will pop up and you'll have a chat option, you'll have a Q&A option. So you can submit questions that way, and Kim will answer them. We're very glad that she's here tonight. It's going to be great. I know it's no mow May, so we're all very mindful of the bees and the pollinators right now. I know I have some questions, so I'm looking forward to getting some more information. Kim is actually doing this presentation again tomorrow for a group in Litchfield.
White Memorial Conservation Center, which is in Litchfield.
There is a lot of interest around pollinator pathways. I think they're they're amazing, and especially in this, during this crisis, a pollinator pathway is something that environmental organizations can really get behind because it's the sort of thing that can be planned digitally. I mean, you can obviously put one in your own yard, but if you wanted to actually do a pathway, you can plan them virtually. You can install them, as an individual or part of your immediate family without necessarily, or utilizing social distancing practices. So it's a great way to have a great project that is beautiful, has a pretty immediate impact on the pollinators, and has a really good effect and benefit for the environment. So it's I think it's a great option for us. Sure, Kimberly Buck said, my granddaughter would like to join. She's studying pollinators in 7th grade this week. Kim, all you have to just send her the Zoom link and that you just got in your email, and she can just click on it and put the password in, and she's good to go. That's great that they're studying pollinators in 7th grade. That's awesome.
Oh, yeah. There's a whole urban schoolyard thing that's going on with pollinators as well.
That is awesome. I think it's great for, you see so many different organizations getting involved. Land trusts take a big leadership role in many of them, but also religious communities and businesses and other environmental organizations. So it's great. Judy Benson said, I planted a pollinator garden this weekend from seeds I started last fall. Oh, that's awesome. Judy, so I'll say this to everybody, please send me pictures if you do a pollinator garden. I would love to post them and celebrate that. That's awesome. This is so great. All right, so hopefully people are just going to be able to jump on. They're still jumping on, but would you like to, I'll just start my little spiel anyway. Go back to my, oh, all right, well, that was my title screen that you saw very quickly, Planting a Pollinator Pathway with Kim Stoner. We're very grateful that she is here. My name is Terry Eichel, and I work with now a couple different, two environmental organizations. But the one I am representing tonight is a faith-based environmental organization called the Interreligious Eco-Justice Network. And we work with religious communities to inspire and encourage them to be faithful stewards of the earth. So it's a great organization. And if you are a member of a faith community and you'd like to hear more about what IREJN has to offer, we are happy to work with you. We have a lot of volunteers and a great board of directors. So Kim is with us tonight. She joined the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment in 1987 after receiving her PhD in etymology from Cornell University and spending a year on a fellowship with the Africa Bureau of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Her PhD and early professional work at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station was in vegetable entomology. In her 30 years at CAES, she has moved from studying plant resistance to insects to other alternatives to insecticides for managing vegetable insects, to holistic case studies of organic farms, to focusing on bees, including both wild bees and honeybees. She is currently studying bee diversity in Connecticut, pollination of pumpkins and squash, and how bees are exposed to pesticides. She also works with people across Connecticut, including farmers, beekeepers, and community groups, in creating habitats for pollinators. So Kim is a absolute expert on this issue, and we are definitely lucky to have her with us tonight. So thank you so much, Kim. And this is co-sponsored by the Emmanuel Congregational Church in Hartford, the Asylum Hill Neighborhood Association, and the Interreligious Ecojustice Network. And I would like to especially thank Lynn Johnson, who is a board member from IREGN and a member of Emmanuel Congregational Church and the Hartford Friends Meeting. Lynn has a wonderful spirit and tremendous amount of energy for this work, and she's been so helpful in helping us promote this. So that has been awesome. And before Kim shares her, before she shares her presentation, I just want to say we will do questions and answers sort of as the presentation goes along. Kim will give a portion of her presentation and then stop for questions. So you can type them into the chat or into the Q&A, and I will sort of follow along and give Kim the questions and she can answer them. And also, this is part of a series, educational series that we offer. And so the next one is actually called Modern Environmental Politics, Why Voting is Your Superpower. And it will be presented by Nathaniel Stinnett, who is the founder and executive director of Environmental Voter. And this will be June 9th. It's a Tuesday evening from 6:30 to 8. And it's very important because apparently the environment is one of the top issues in the general public when they do surveys, but among likely voters, it falls tremendously. And that's because apparently environmentalists don't really vote. They're not reliable voters. And so part of this project and the purpose of this webinar is how we can engage our fellow environmentalists to get them out to the voting booths. So that will be our next one. But now I will turn this over to Kim. Did I miss anything? All right, okay. So thanks everyone for joining us. I'm going to stop share and Kim can take it away.
Okay, and I am going to try and share my screen, which is always a bit of a challenge here. All right, hopefully you are seeing my first slide.
We can see it.
Good, okay. So as this title indicates, I'm going to talk mostly about bees. I'm going to talk a little bit at the beginning about the broad range of pollinators. And then I'm going to talk some about honeybees because people always want to know about how honeybees are doing. And then I will talk more about planting for a diversity of bees, which is more kind of along the lines of what I do. So, and the first slide did not advance. Whoop, there we go. Land acknowledgement. So, one of the things I've started doing recently is a land acknowledgement at the beginning of my talks. It's important to acknowledge that I am on the traditional land of the Quinnipiac, Pagusset, and Wappinger peoples. Many of you will be joining me from land of other people, including Mohican and Skagdakota people. Because we're online, you may be on the land of other people. And it took me a long time. I've been talking about native plants and insects for a long time, and it took me quite a while to really connect that with the native people. But we acknowledge that native people have lived and still live in community with these creatures in this place for approximately 12,500 years. There was just an archaeological dig in Avon that found artifacts from people, native people who lived here 12,500 years ago. We thank them for their strength and their resilience in protecting this land, and we aspire to follow their example. So, okay. I think I did multiple at a time. Yes, there we go. So pollinators. So in the broad sense, pollinators are any kind of animal that carries pollen from one flower to another. And people have calculated that 87% of all plant species are pollinated by some kind of animal. Bees, I would say, are number one, and there's a lot of agreement about that. Number two is probably flies, but there are many other pollinators as well, including wasps and beetles, moths, ants, and birds and bats too. As you probably know, crop pollination is critical to our food supply. Nearly all the fruits, nuts, and fruiting vegetables, things like squash and cucumbers, tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers, either require or benefit from insect pollinators. And then insects in general are an essential source of food for other wildlife as well. So there are some plants that we eat that are self-pollinated or wind-pollinated. A lot of the grains are wind-pollinated, but in large part, our other food requires or benefits from pollinators. As I just mentioned, flies are an important group of pollinators. And so I always say that when people start to really care about flies, then you know that they really care about pollination. And when you go out and you look at flowers, you will definitely see flies. This is actually mountain mint, which is a plant that attracts a really wide diversity of pollinators, including bees and a lot of diversity of wasps, but also flies. And this picture I actually took yesterday. Yeah, yesterday. This is Packer aurea, which has a number of common names. Some people call it groundsel, and this is a fly feeding on that flower. A lot of people are interested in butterflies. One reason why I specialize in talking about bees is that each group of insects has its own special needs. And butterflies, as you may know, are not only need flowers to visit, but they also need larval host plants. So that's like a whole separate subject. What kinds of caterpillars different species of butterflies need for their larvae to develop. Similarly, flies have a whole other set of requirements that I'm not going to get into. But also, butterflies themselves are pollinators, but not tremendously important pollinators. A much more important group of pollinators are moths. And actually, I'm showing you a paper that was just published last week that I just found in the last couple of days about moths. So moths are in the same group as butterflies, Lepidoptera, but they are generally night flying while the butterflies are day flying. And we don't really know enough about these night flying pollinators. And so this was a study saying that the moths that they studied in Britain on the edge of an agricultural landscape were very important in transporting pollen of the wildflowers along the edge of the landscape. So pollinating insects are pretty broad. And there are also insects that are pollinators and that need nectar or pollen that are also involved in biological control of pest insects. So these are some examples of that. Hoverflies, which entomologists call syrphid flies, their larvae feed on aphids. They are flies, so their larvae are maggots, and those maggots feed on aphids, and they're very important predators of aphids. Tachinid flies lay their eggs in caterpillars or squash bugs, depending on the species of tachinid fly, and their larvae hatch out and feed internally on some insects that are pests of agriculture. And then there's a whole range of parasitic wasps that also lay their eggs in the bodies of some of our important crop pests, like aphids. That's what this particular wasp is doing, is laying her egg in an aphid, and then the larvae feed from the inside on these pest insects and eventually kill the insect. So biological control in agriculture is also affected by what plants are available for these insects that feed as adults on nectar and pollen. There's a little delay in moving forward here. So, but when we deal with bees, we need to deal with the fact that a lot of people are afraid of bees and afraid of getting stung. So most stings that we get in the US are actually from yellow jackets, which are not bees. They are wasps. They are social wasps. As I'm going to, these are just a few examples of yellow jackets, the most important species of yellow jackets in terms of stinging people. And it's the social bees and wasps that are more likely to sting. They have a large nest to defend. They have a large number of workers that can be sacrificed to save the colony. So if you think about honeybees, an example of a social bee, they store honey, they store pollen, and they have what the beekeepers call brood. A large part of their colony is made up of larvae that are defenseless. And so there are a lot of vertebrates, things like skunks and bears, that will feed on honeybee colonies. And now actually that there are more bears around, beekeepers often have to use electric fences to keep the bears away from their honeybee colonies. So these social insects realistically have to defend themselves from vertebrates. The solitary bees and wasps generally don't sting unless you're an entomologist and you're trying to catch them in a net, or you trap them in your clothing. Some of the solitary bees we'll talk about don't even have venom. So a solitary bee or a solitary wasp is a species in which the female makes her own nest and doesn't share a nest with other females, like in honeybees or bumblebees, or even those social wasps that we just saw, the yellow jacket wasps. Some of these solitary bees and wasps do nest in aggregations, but each female is still making her own nest, and this doesn't make them more likely to sting. And then one thing to just note is that only female bees and wasps can sting. A stinger is a modified ovipositor, and the male bees and wasps don't have ovipositors and don't have stingers. So people want to know how honeybees are doing. So as you probably know, honeybees are important pollinators of crop plants, and they are moved all over the US to pollinate different different crop plants, almonds in California, for example, or blueberries in Maine. They are not native to North America. They were brought here pretty much as soon as Europeans got here. They were brought from Europe. People are concerned about honeybees because beekeepers do lose a lot of colonies each year. This is from a survey that's done by a group that's called Bee Informed. And the survey started in 2006, the winter of 2006 to 2007, which is when colony collapse disorder happened. And at first they were just studying the winter loss of bees, and then in more recent years, when they've gotten more funding, they studied the total annual loss of bees. And you can see from this graph that there are years where the total annual loss of bees is as much as 45%, and quite a few years where it's like 35%. So beekeeping is hard. Beekeepers lose a lot of colonies each year. But when we see the next slide, when it comes up, we will see that the total number of colonies is not currently crashing. And this is an old slide, so it only goes up to 2012, but it's still true, as it says at the bottom, as of April 2018, and it's still true today, that the number of colonies in the US still is fluctuating between about 2.5 million colonies and close to 3 million colonies. So beekeepers have ways of replacing what they have lost. They can split the colonies that survive. They can raise nucleus colonies. They can buy queens from queen breeders and move some of their existing bees in with those queens and set up new colonies. They have ways of multiplying up to make up their losses, but it's expensive. And so it's difficult to be a beekeeper. It's expensive to be a beekeeper. And the price that farmers are paying beekeepers to bring in honeybee colonies keeps going up because of the difficulties. But honeybees are not going to go extinct. As long as there's economic reason for them to keep going. And so so a lot of the warning signs that I get in my Facebook post about how honeybees are going to go extinct and we're all going to die are probably not true. So the biggest problem for beekeepers is this pandemic, actually. I wasn't using that word before when I would talk about this, but it really is. It's a pandemic. So it's the spread of these mites, varroa mites, that were originally on an Asian species of bee, spread to the species of bee that we use, the Western honeybee, which is Apis mellifera, which is the species that's domesticated over most of the world, and that spread of that mite increased the incidence and the severity of a lot of viruses that honeybees have. So we've now found something like 22 different viruses in honeybees, and some of them, particularly one that's called deformed wing virus, is known to have become much worse with the advent of these mites that spread the viruses and are even spilling over out of honeybees into bumblebees at least, and maybe into some other bees as well. So I think with that, I'm going to pause for some questions. If you want to feed me some questions.
Sure, absolutely. So I have a couple questions. Let's see here. Andy would like to know, is there a difference between wasps and hornets?
So hornets are a subset of wasps. So there's and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense what we call hornets. They're a particular group of social wasps that are in sort of the same group with what we call yellow jackets. But wasps is a huge category. There are in the United States something like 20,000 different species of wasps. So wasp is a huge category. Hornets is a very much smaller category.
Okay, and Sue would like to know, before honeybees came to America, were they basically domesticated or from the wild?
So honeybees had been domesticated in Europe for a long time before they were brought to the US. There are wild honeybees in some parts of the world. Rather than keeping honeybees in hives, there are what are called honey hunters. So there are people who go and find the honeybee colonies in the wild and harvest the honey from them, pretty much destroy them, open them up, take the honey out. And so there have been a lot of inventions that people have developed to make it possible for people to domesticate honeybees and to remove the honey without having to destroy the colony.
Oh, she just froze up a little bit. Lynn Fulkerson just said, we have a pollinator garden at our community garden. Many of the plants were grown by high school students. I think it's amazing. I think that's a great way to get kids involved in the community gardens. And so if you're, oh, someone else had another question. So two more questions. Can you discuss the effects of neonicotinoids? And yeah, so actually we'll just go with that one.
So that's later on in the talk. I'm going to talk a lot about neonicotinoids.
Okay, great. And so another question was, to create pollinatory pathways, what is the optimal distance between the gardens?
Oh, why don't we get to that later on too?
Okay.
Save that.
All right. Well, we're going to put a pin in both of those. Let me see if there are any questions in the chat. Nope, that was it in the Q&A. So if you joined us a little bit late, just so you know, we're taking questions in the chat and, oh, another question came in, the chat and the Q&A. So another question is, do you advocate for organic treatment for varroa by dusting with icing sugar rather than antibiotics and chemical/pharmaceutical treatment?
So people have used the confectioner sugar and it has some effect on the mites. It makes it difficult for the mites to hang on to the bees, and it doesn't hurt the bees at all. So that is one treatment. It's not as effective as other kinds of treatment. There are some other treatments that are plant-based, that are based on plant oils. One of them is Hop Guard, which is based, as you might expect, on hop plant oils. There are some others that are based on thyme oils. And beekeepers in general are moving away from some of the harsher chemicals like coumaphos and benvalerate into some of these more plant-based chemicals, but there are still synthetic chemicals that that beekeepers use, and so it depends a lot on the feelings of the beekeepers. I don't do really the recommendations for beekeepers. That's done by our apiary inspector, and he basically gives them a list of a lot of different options and lets them make their own choices about which ones they want to use.
So Judy actually had a question. What remedy do you recommend when social bees and other insects nest in the eaves of a house or under a deck?
Oh, okay. So so there are lists of beekeepers who will come and collect swarms of honeybees. And the experiment station keeps a list, the experiment station where I work. Also, the Connecticut Beekeepers Association keeps a list. Some of those beekeepers will remove bees from structures. It's more difficult, and it's more difficult for them to get, to get actually a functioning swarm too when they have to remove them from structures. But there are some beekeepers who feel like that's part of their obligation as beekeepers to remove honeybees when they get into structures. So that deals with honeybees. Sometimes other kinds of bees will get, not very often will bumblebees, for example, get into a structure, and it's typically pretty open, like underneath a porch. And in that case, those are they're not really very likely to sting you, and they are annual, so their nests are only going to last for a year. A more difficult problem is when the social wasps, like yellow jackets, get into a structure. They also have annual colonies, so their colonies only last a year, but their colonies can get quite large, and particularly in the fall, they can get pretty aggressive in terms of stinging. So in that case, you might actually need to call an exterminator and get help with removing the yellow jackets when they get into a structure.
So Lynn was wondering, thank you for that. Lynn Johnson was wondering, what are the best plants to support bees?
Oh, that's a large part of what I have to talk about. So we'll move on.
Okay, all right,
That's
so
another
great.
thing to put a pin in. Okay.
All right, terrific.
So you've had a while to look at this slide about honeybees. So honeybees are really bizarre insects. They're just not like any other insects, much less any other bees that we have in this country. One of the things is that they spend the winter active as a tight cluster of workers and queens. So they don't ever go dormant, and they keep the temperature up in that cluster. And so that's one reason why they have to store honey, is in order to have enough honey to burn in their metabolism as fuel to keep the temperature up all winter long inside a honeybee hive. And then the queen of a honeybee hive only exists outside the colony when she goes on her mating flight. She flies off, mates with as many of the male bees that are called drones as she can, and then flies back into the colony and spends the rest of her life in the colony. And so that makes her quite a bit different from even like the queen bumblebees, as I'll talk about in a little bit. So honeybees are very peculiar animals, and they have this wonderful, which you've probably heard about, way of communicating within a colony where the sources of pollen and nectar are. So there's a lot more to bees than just honeybees. So this is where we make the transition from honeybees to all these other bees. And a lot of people think that our crops are entirely dependent on honeybees, and that, for the most part, is not true. So in each of these graphs, the sort of light blue slice of the pie it represents the visitation by honeybees to the crop. The dark blue is the bumblebees. Orangish is carpenter bees, which are pollinators. People always ask about carpenter bees, so I'll probably talk some more about them. And then the other categories she had, Nancy Adamson had in her thesis, were medium and small, but we'll talk some more about what some of those bees would be. But you can see that honeybees are not even the majority of pollinators for in this study for all these different crop plants in Virginia. So honeybees are important when we grow crop plants on a really huge scale, and they bloom for a short time. And the native local bees can't take care of all that bloom at once. And so, as I mentioned before, like almonds in California, blueberries in Maine. But for a lot of crops, the native bees are as important or more important than honeybees and take care of a lot of the pollination. And there we go. So bee diversity in Connecticut, we're working on a checklist of the bees of Connecticut, and we certainly have more than 349 species of bees in our state, in our little state. 9 of the species come from somewhere else other than the US, and the rest are native here. Honeybees, as I've mentioned, are exotic and social. We historically had 16 species of bumblebees. I'll talk a good bit more about bumblebees. 10 species of Calides, which are a solitary bee that I'll show you some pictures of. 20 species of mason bees, 84 species of digger bees, lots and lots of species of sweat bees. So there's a lot more diversity to the bees in Connecticut than most people realize. One of the things that we do to look at bee diversity is to set out little bee traps. So this is a pretty low effort way of sampling bees in different environments in a repeatable way so that we can look at trends over the long term. So it's important to be able to do it the same way every year. And so we set out 9 of these little bowls, and they're in 3 different colors, blue, yellow, and white. And they're sort of mimics of flowers. So the bees, some bees, not all species of bees, but some bees mistake them for flowers and fly in and get trapped. And we then bring them back to the lab and identify them. And so we've been doing this for about 10 years now on the experiment station sites and also some cooperator sites, the White Memorial Conservation Center and the Stuart McKinney National Wildlife Refuge in Westbrook. And I'm going to be talking tomorrow at the White Memorial Conservation Center. So I made a slide about what we found in 1 year with these traps. So this is just what flew into those traps. 9 little traps at the White Memorial Conservation Center. And this is 1 year of the 10 years that we've sampled. And we found 17 genera and 54 species in those 17 genera. So for example, we found 12 species in the genus Andrena, including this bee, which is a specialist on bellwort, so this is a rare bee that is specialized to hang upside down and feed in the flowers of this bell-like flower. So to look a little more at some of these bees in the genus Andrena, they are all ground nesting. They're all solitary. In general, they have no venom. Some of them have even lost their stinger. Many of them are plant specialists on a particular group of plants, and there are 84 species in Connecticut. And this is a study from New York State looking at the bees on apple trees. In this study, you can see that about half of the bees were mining bees. So those are all bees in the genus Andrena. And there were something like 60 different species of Andrena on apple trees in New York State. Honeybees were a substantial chunk of the bees on apple trees. And then some of the other groups that we've seen before, sweat bees, some bumblebees, some of the cellophane bees, mason bees. So again, this diversity of bees is important for our food supply, including those Andrena bees. This is what the life cycle of a solitary bee looks like. So, for example, those bees in the genus Andrena that would make nests in the ground, each female, they're solitary bees, so each female makes her own nest. She would make a tunnel in the ground, and then she makes a little cell off of that tunnel. And that's what you see over on the right is a cell. And in that cell, she would put a mixture of pollen and nectar. And now, actually, people recently have been studying what happens, and there's like a fermentation process that happens. And actually, she lays her egg then on that little ball of pollen and nectar, and her larva hatches out and eats that food. And now people think that the larva is feeding not just on the pollen and nectar directly, but actually on the fermentation products, the yeasts and the bacteria that are growing on that pollen and nectar. And that larva develops until it gets to the overwintering stage, which for this example would be a pupa. And then the pupa stays in the ground until the adult emerges the next year. So each of these solitary species of bees has only one generation a year, and the adults are typically only active for about 6 to 8 weeks. So the males typically come out first, and then females, they mate, then the females make these nests for, maybe 4 or 5 weeks. And then the rest of the life cycle happens underground. The larva develops, gets to an overwintering stage, and that's the cycle. So it's very, very different from honeybees. And so some of these bees are specialists. Many of the solitary bees are specialists. This particular bee is a squash bee. So this is a specialist in a different genus, in the genus Eucera, on pumpkins and squash, just the genus Cucurbita. So it feeds, what it means for a solitary bee to be a specialist is that it feeds its larvae only the pollen of particular group of plants. So this particular bee only feeds its larvae the pollen of pumpkins and squash and nothing else, although they can feed on nectar from other kinds of flowers. So do native bees need native plants? So some bees are generalist. So the social bees, so honeybees, bumblebees, some of the sweat bees have to be generalists because they have to maintain their colonies over the whole season. So they may have particular preferences for native plants, but they have to be able to adapt to a wide range of plants. Solitary bees, as I just talked about, have a short season of activity. So they may specialize on the pollen of a particular genus of plants that blooms during the time when they're active, or just a few genera, or they could be more generalized that feed on a lot of different blooming plants in their habitat during their period of activity. So, so there are certainly some bees that are totally dependent on native plants, and there are other bees that are more generalists. And there we go. And so here are some of the plant genera that have specialist bees. So goldenrod, if you've ever gone out and looked at goldenrod, on the insects on goldenrod when it's in bloom, it's amazing. So there are 11 species of specialist bees on goldenrod. There's a huge number of other bees, including honeybees and bumblebees, but also just an enormous number of different wasps and beetles and flies, all kinds of things on goldenrod. Goldenrod is a great plant for pollinators of all kinds. Some of the asters, like New England aster, have specialist bees. yellow loosestrife, which is very different from the purple loosestrife, which is an invasive plant. The yellow loosestrife is a native plant. Sunflowers, you know, some of the ground cherries, and then there are also trees and shrubs. So a lot of times people think of pollinator habitat as just being wildflowers, but trees and shrubs are also really important, and I'll talk more about that. But willows have their own specialized species of bees, and they also have, they're very important for honeybees as well, and other generalist bees, blueberries, and that whole genus, and related species in the Ericaceae. So, you know, so there are definitely native plants with specialist native bees. So now we're going to switch gears and talk about bumblebees. And this is a bumblebee on mountain mint. Bumblebees are important pollinators too. So these are bumblebees that are on female squash flowers. You saw that bumblebees are important for the cucurbits earlier in an earlier slide. I studied pumpkin and squash flowers, and on the order of 2/3 of the visitors to pumpkin and squash flowers are bumblebees, and there are more effective pollinators of pumpkin and squash than honeybees, because they actually land on the stigma of the flowers, which honeybees usually try to avoid. So as I mentioned, we historically had 16 species of bumblebees here in Connecticut. Some of our bumblebees are clearly gone. So the top of that list, Bombus affinis, that you may know as the rusty patched bumblebee, which is an endangered species in the US. We have not seen it here in Connecticut since 1997. It used to be a pretty common bee. A number of people at Conn College in particular and in New London have told me that they used to do ecological studies on Bombus affinis and looking at what different flowers it visited. So it was a common enough bee for them to have their students studying its behavior. But it's gone from here. There are some pockets of it in the Midwest and some pockets in the Appalachian Mountains. We don't have it here as far as we know. And Bombus ashtoni probably has not been around for quite a long time. Some other bees that are state listed, like Bombus terricola, a ways down that list, is a state listed species, but we have found it. We went out specifically to look for it in the northwest corner of the state and found it, so it still exists here. And there are some other bees on this list that have been declining regionally, and we are not sure if they still exist here in Connecticut, like Bombus pennsylvanicus. So, and bumblebees have been declining not just here in the northeastern United States, but really all over the world. People found bumblebees in decline in Europe long before we studied them thoroughly here in the Northeast. And there are studies in China and in Latin America, all around the world, finding that we're losing bumblebee species diversity. So the life cycle of a bumblebee, so at this time of year, you might see some queen bumblebees foraging. So I'll start in the winter. In the winter, the only bumblebees alive are mated queens. So the mated queens find little holes to hole up in and go dormant over the winter. And they come out in the spring, and I often see them in the spring, like zigzagging back and forth over the ground, looking for a place to establish a nest. So the queen bumblebee is like a single mom. She's mated. She's has to establish her own nest. She has to go out and forage do her work for her own food and also to feed her young. She builds the nest herself, actually, with wax. She and then she lays eggs on the stored pollen and nectar. And at the top, what you see is a queen bumblebee incubating her young. So she actually heats up her abdomen to make her larvae develop faster. She consumes a lot of nectar in order to do that. So she has a little honey pot in front of her. That's all that she can store, is like a thimble full of honey. So she has to go out and do foraging pretty much every day until the larvae hatch out into workers, and then it becomes a social colony, and the workers take over and they maintain the nest, they do the foraging, and the queen stays in the nest more like a queen honeybee does. And then there comes a point in the development of the nest, sort of late summer or early fall, when the colony starts to produce males and new queens. The males mate with the new queens, and then it's only, as I said, the mated queens that overwinter. So they need to bulk up in order to be able to survive the winter and the early spring. They need a lot of pollen and nectar to do that. And then all the rest of the bumblebees die. All the workers, all the males die, and just the mated queens go through the winter. And so, so this is a study from England looking at what do we need to do for wild pollinators. And in particular, they looked in a lot of detail at what for bumblebees. And so, as you would expect from that rundown of life cycle, some really critical periods are early in the season when the queens are establishing their nests and incubating their larvae, and late in the season when new queens are bulking up. But what the study in England found is that needs to be combined with lots of sources of nutritious pollen through the rest of the summer. And then that's when the bumblebee colonies expand and reach the point where they're able then to produce new males and new queens. They also need nesting habitat. We don't know enough really about bumblebee nesting habitat. Some of them nest underground, often in abandoned nests of other species. Some of them nest in bunch grasses. Some of them even nest in like abandoned bird nests. So there's a lot we need to learn about overwintering habitat and nesting habitat for bumblebees. And they, of course, need to be protected from pesticides as well. This comes from my colleague Ann Averill in Massachusetts. And so these are plants on which they found queen bumblebees, or they found the pollen on queen bumblebees. So you can see again that trees and shrubs are really important. Flowering trees and shrubs are really important, including things like rhododendrons and willows and dogwoods, and some things that we don't think of as flowering, like holly, American holly, European holly. I went out today at lunchtime and took pictures of bees in the European holly that is around the experiment station where I work. There are a lot of bees that feed on holly. Black cherry. So again, the plants in the genus Ilex, which are the hollies, the willows. Things like blueberry as well. So a whole range of trees and shrubs are really what's most important for the queen bumblebees in the spring. And at some point, this will go forward. Okay, now I'm going to switch and talk some more about pesticides. So maybe we should pause again and get some more questions, and then I'll talk about pesticides.
Great, terrific. Yes, I have some questions in here. So let's see, I believe the next one that was, you covered best plants to support bees. And also for anyone who is wondering, this, Kim has provided me with a resource sheet that I'll be emailing out to you. Plus, this is actually being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube. So you'll be able to watch it again, move forward, pause on a screen if you want to write something down. So Lynn wanted to know, there is a no mow May campaign now to protect the bees. Can you say if this will really help the grounding nesting bees? The ground nesting bees, sorry.
Ground nesting bees. Yeah. So I don't know for sure whether it will help ground nesting bees specifically. Um, there was a study in Springfield, Massachusetts, actually looking at reducing just the frequency of mowing. So they were looking at suburban lawns, and they compared lawns that were mowed once a week or once a week, once every 2 weeks, or once every 3 weeks. And they found that they got much more diversity of and abundance of bees in the lawns that were mowed every 3 weeks instead of 2 weeks or 1 week. So, and I think that would be particularly important in May because there are a lot of little flowers that bloom in people's lawns if they're not using herbicide to keep them out in May. Things like white clover, violets, um, uh, some of things like gill over the ground, a lot of those little mint related plants. There are a lot of things that bloom in the spring that if you don't mow your lawn in May would benefit a wide variety of bees. I am not sure. There are also bees, as I mentioned, that nest in bunch grasses, but if they're nesting in bunch grasses and you don't mow and then you mow later, that probably wouldn't help them. So you would need to like quit mowing altogether, really, for those bees. Or mow very high, one or the other. Other questions?
Yeah. So Andy said, a quince bush outside my house used to attract a plethora of bumblebees. This year, I noticed that despite plenty of blossoms, I see only a handful of bees. Is something going on, or are the bees active at different times that I'm not noticing?
That it might be related to how cold it was. It suddenly got very cold. So some plants started to bloom and then it got colder, probably too cold for many of the bees that would be visiting. That would be my guess, is it was probably that cold snap.
Well, do you think they'll come back once the?
Yeah, if the flowers are still going, yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So Sue said, and you may have seen this floating around social media. She said, "We love bees, but not when they drill holes in our house. Is it worth crocheting some fake hornet nests to scare them off?" I don't know if you saw that on Facebook. Some creative woman had crocheted a fake hornet nest and said that the wasps had left her alone, or the bees had left her alone. So
yeah, so you're mixing together different things. So carpenter bees are the bees that drill holes in your house. And so the hornets, the fake hornet nests are not going to scare away carpenter bees. They might scare away hornets. I don't know. But the carpenter bees, what I usually say to people is carpenter bees are good pollinators. It's this time of year in particular, I see a lot of carpenter bees out on the flowers. They are good pollinators, but that doesn't mean you have to let them do structural damage to your house. So it takes years for them to do structural damage to your house, but they do actually expand their nests each year. So if you leave the nest year after year, eventually they can actually do some real damage. I hate to say this, but in this case, I would say you might want to actually use some insecticide carefully targeted just into the holes, in order to kill off the carpenter bees. And then you might need to do some repairs to the wood in order to make sure and seal off the wood to make sure that the carpenter bees don't come back and start making more holes in your wood.
Okay. Are dandelions good for bees?
So dandelions are good for bees. Dandelions are not native plants, actually, but they also came over here with the Europeans. Um, and honeybees particularly like dandelion. So oftentimes the non-native bees like the non-native plants. Um, uh, but yeah, they do produce a lot of pollen. And so I do see other kinds of bees in them as well.
Mindy wanted to know, she said, I have been told not to clean out gardens until after the temp is 50 degrees to prevent disturbing overwintering bees. My question is this 50 degrees during the day or 50 degrees at night? And she's talking about like the average temperature. Does it have to be 50 degrees average temper for 24 hours, or is it just during the day?
So, um, you know, it's a tricky thing to tell people when not to when to and when not to disturb um, their potential habitats, because there are a lot of different creatures and they have different life cycles. So it's a it's a tricky question. Um, and so honeybees start to fly with like 50 degrees during the day. But a lot of the things that are overwintering in your environment are going to be in hollow stems. I didn't really talk that much about that, but there are bees that nest in hollow stems, or that actually make holes in stems in order to nest in there. There are bees that will nest in brush. And so uh, they and for example, the solitary bees, they're going to be in the ground all the time except for this 6 weeks that they're up out of the ground. And that is different for different species of solitary bees. There are a lot of solitary bees that are active in the spring, but there are also solitary bees that are active in the fall. So there's not sort of a one size fits all answer to that question.
Is there like a better time, like when people, obviously people are looking at putting their gardens in and that sort of thing, but I know a lot of people are very sensitive to that.
I would say, well, so what I do, I'll tell you what I do. So what I do is um, I leave the native plants over the winter, and eventually we'll get to pictures of my garden. Actually, I leave the plants, the stalks and everything over the winter. I pull them out in the spring when new growth starts, and then I don't dispose of them all together. I just move them into a pile in the backyard so that anything that's overwintering in them can still emerge. Um, so I guess that's my answer to that question.
When would you rake out a garden so that with leaves and stuff like that?
So I lied about that. I leave my leaves. I don't ever rake out all the leaves.
Oh, you leave the
um,
leaves all the time.
so
Okay.
yeah, so I don't have a lawn, so it's not going to kill my lawn. Um, and I rake the leaves out of the driveway, and I rake the leaves out of the sidewalk, and the little tiny patch of lawn that I have between the sidewalk and the street. And the rest of my yard, I leave all the leaves.
Even in any gardens, you just let it go.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess not really in my vegetable garden. exactly. Yeah, I do take them. They don't fall that much in my vegetable garden because the vegetable garden's in the sun. But
Mm,
yeah, um, but also there would be slugs, more slugs in the vegetable garden if I left the leaves. So
mm.
I just move those out into the yard, into the rest of the yard.
Okay. Rayanne would like to know how the temperature in the hive is controlled.
So the honeybees, um, are good at sensing temperature. So in the winter, they are in a cluster and they are heating themselves up and heating up the queen to the required temperature. As I said, it can get to be like 90 degrees in there when the queen starts laying eggs. Um, and they actually rotate in the cluster so that the bees on the outside can move to the inside, and so they sort of circulate around, because a honeybee that's exposed too long to too cold a temperature will just die. um, then in the summer they regulate the temperature by fanning. So they actually fan their wings to circulate air through the hive, and they go out and they collect water. Honeybees actually have to collect water for temperature regulation and also to dilute their honey so that they can can consume it. So they're just a really tightly regulated system. They have ways of communicating with each other chemically and physically to be a thermostat.
So why don't we pause on the questions and just keep going with the presentation, I think?
Okay, all right. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about pesticides. So uh, bees are insects. So uh, almost all insecticides are toxic to a wide range of insects, which includes bees. Um, so, and then as I've mentioned a little bit, bees are also have synergistic relationships with fungi. So fungicides can also affect bees. This is a hot area of research right now, is how do fungicides affect honeybees and other kinds of bees. Um, and then there's some evidence of herbicides affecting bees, but herbicides are much more likely to affect bees by killing off the plants that they're using. So in general, it's just good to use integrated pest management and minimize pesticide use alternative methods of control. And then when you use a pesticide, use it the most effectively. Use it the least amount needed and at the location where it will be most effective. Avoid getting any insecticides on plants that are in bloom. For example, people with orchards, when they are applying insecticides, they mow. They don't apply insecticides when their fruit trees are blooming because that would kill off their pollinators. But also when they apply insecticides at other times, they mow down any blooming plants in the aisles between their fruit trees in order to avoid killing bees. Identify any honeybee hives and work with beekeepers to protect the hives. And then systemic insecticides are restricted use pesticides in Connecticut. So unless you have a pesticide license, you are not allowed to buy these these most toxic neonicotinoids. There are other neonicotinoids that are less toxic to bees, but these particular ones you can't buy. And I will talk some more about why and what effects they have on bees and how they are used in agriculture when the slide advances. There we go. So neonicotinoids, you probably, at least some of you have heard of them because you asked the question. Neonicotinoids are, I think, they're a number of them are very toxic to bees. And also the big problem is they're used on a really enormous scale, particularly as seed treatments in this country. So there are more acres in the US treated with neonicotinoids than for any other insecticide ever in the history of the United States. And in some places, for example, in the Midwest, where they rotate corn and soybeans and wheat, or they rotate corn and cotton, they're using neonicotinoid treated seed throughout the rotation. So on different crops in the same place. And it's not even clear whether that has the seed treatment has any economic benefit in many of the cases in which it's used. It's become just like the default. I can tell you that at one point I was trying to buy seed of canola for some experiments, and I specifically asked them not to treat the seed, and I got treated seed. And I called up the seed company, and they said, "Oh, we just assumed that you would want treated seed because it's better." um, so and so the overuse and the misuse of pesticides has been studied for many decades, since before I became an entomologist, even so, like 50 years. And the overuse of any insecticide has negative effects on insect natural enemies and risks developing resistance to the insecticide in the pests. So, so these are some graphs that show the huge expansion of the use of neonicotinoids in seed treatments, particularly in corn and soybeans, but also in a number of other crops too. And they travel. So they're systemic insecticides. So they travel in the plant. And one characteristic that they have that makes them able to travel in the plant is that they're water soluble. So, so when you apply neonicotinoids to seeds, 5% of it goes in the crop. 1% of it goes off at dust, which is actually has been part of the reason why these seeds have been involved in honeybee kills, is that in spring, when the honeybees are flying and this dust is in the air, the honeybees have the dust very much attracted to them. There's like a negative charge on honeybees that the dust sticks to the honeybees and kills them. But then it also travels in soil and soil water and ends up in the plants on the field margin and ends up in the waterways. So in Europe, they've banned a lot of these neonicotinoids because of the effects on bees and other pollinators. In Canada, they're banning these because of effects on aquatic insects, because they're getting into waterways. So, but we still use them in agriculture in this country. And this is a study actually by a Canadian scientist, Susan Chan, who was looking at soil pesticides and their effect on soil nesting bees. So of course, a lot of bees are nesting in the soil. She was studying squash bees, and squash bees, as we talked about, are specialists. They feed their larvae only the pollen of squash and pumpkin plants. They often nest in squash and pumpkin fields, often, and also often in cornfields, I find, near pumpkin fields. And when these pesticides get in the ground, then that affects these soil nesting bees. So so backing up a little bit into pollinator habitat. So ideally, pollinator habitat involves native trees and shrubs, native herbaceous perennials, with enough diversity to have at least 3 species in flower through the entire growing season, looking beyond just the bees to have larval host plants for moths and butterfly caterpillars, no insecticides or fungicides, and minimal use of herbicides to manage the invasive species. And then providing nesting habitat, so patches of bare ground, brush, dead wood, and leaves. But on a more practical level, really just about anything is better than one. And having a lot of diversity is good. So let's see. Get this to move. So pollinator habitat. So I've worked some with farms on pollinator habitat, but it's a little problematic for farms because if they are not organic farms, or even if there are organic farms that use some insecticides, they have to protect their pollinator habitat from the insecticides. So the picture on the top right is a squash field on an organic farm that doesn't use any pesticides on their squash. So they could grow buckwheat in between the squash. Buckwheat is not a native plant, but it is very good for honeybees and syrphid flies, and so it benefits the pollination of the squash. The picture below is yellow sweet clover, again, which is not a native plant, but is being grown on this livestock farm for grazing. And then this farmer also is a beekeeper. So this is a great plant for honeybees. And so the beekeeper takes advantage of it. And then over on the left is a mix of native plants. So that's goldenrod and anise hyssop. And that's also on an organic farm that specifically designated an area for pollinator habitat. But for farms that are not free of pesticide, they need to be planning their pollinator habitat to be far enough away from where they're applying the pesticides to prevent creating an ecological trap, creating a place where the pollinators will come in to visit the flowers, and then you spray them with pesticides. So these are recommendations from the Xerces Society, which is in your information resource handout. The Xerces Society is a society for the conservation of invertebrates. And they work on a lot of different invertebrates, but have done a lot of really great work with pollinators. So farmers need to keep their pollinator habitat far away, but that means that the rest of us can provide pollinator habitat, and it benefits the farms as well as benefiting the native plants and other kinds of plants in our environment. So this is my yard. And as I said, I don't rake the leaves in my yard, and I don't have very much lawn. The only lawn I have is actually not in this picture. It's between the sidewalk and the street. And there's a little narrow strip there, which I'm still working at carving away, actually. I've got mountain mint in there, and I planted a tree in there. So actually the picture on the left was taken this weekend. So that is Packer Aria, and beneath my cherry tree. And in the back, what you see is actually mostly violets. I have a ground cover of violets. I have other fruit bushes. I have some blueberries. I have elderberries. And I do have a vegetable garden. You can see a little corner of the fence for my vegetable garden. And I have also some vegetables that I grow in the front yard as well. The ones that the woodchucks don't bother, because I have an amazing population of woodchucks. So this is a book that I wish that I had when I was designing my yard, Native Plants for the Small Yard. And the book is actually on the Pollinator Pathway website in its entirety. And you can see all these little designs for the corner of a yard, for actually the strip between the sidewalk and the street, different kinds of areas for that where you can plant native plants. As I said, also, I don't remove the leaves from my yard, and this is a recommendation from the Xerces Society. So leaves help to provide overwintering habitat for quite a diversity of different insects, including some kinds of bees, but also fireflies, moths, and then grass tussocks, as I mentioned, are where some of the bumblebees nest, brush piles, pithy stems of perennials, fallen logs of branches. So providing, not having a neat yard, having a messy yard provides lots of habitat for lots of creatures. This is online from the experiment station. If you have invasives that are ornamental, a lot of our invasives originally were introduced as ornamental plant species and you want to replace them. This gives you native plants that will replace the ornamental plants and that will also be ornamental. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about rights of way. So this is an issue that I've gotten involved in just in the last few months. The rights of way were historically in Connecticut managed beautifully for a great diversity of wildlife, including pollinators. And the principles for this integrated vegetation management were actually developed at Conn College by Bill Nearing. They, in the old days, they used to, the power companies used to like blast everything with herbicides. And instead, they discovered if they used selected, targeted use of herbicides, just remove the tree species that would get to be tall, they would have a shrub layer that would suppress new saplings, and they could have an herbaceous layer right underneath the towers. And that was fabulous habitat for bees and for rare plants and for birds. However, unfortunately, they've been changing their policies, particularly Eversource, since it has taken over the electrical transmission. So this is actually from a study by Dave Wagner, who's a scientist at UConn, studying the diversity of pollinators. He's a lepidopterist, but also studies bees. And also Ken Metzler, who's a botanist, studying the diversity of organisms in these transmission lines. And you can see that they do have access roads in the transmission lines, but they're quite narrow, and there's a lot of shrub and herbaceous plant diversity. And so these were really great habitats. But even as they were doing this study, Eversource was coming in and doing this to them. Creating these wide gravel roads covered with impermeable gravel. They were doing it in order to replace wooden transmission poles with steel transmission poles. But they were really doing much
Mm-hmm.
more damage than they really needed to do. And they are continuing to do that as we speak. I had actually in March a forum on how to protect your local transmission right-of-way from this kind of destruction. And so this information is now on the website of the Connecticut Land Conservation Council. And I put this link also into your information resources, because if you are anywhere near a transmission line right-of-way and they haven't already done this destruction, they will be coming for your right-of-way. And so you need to know how to protect it. So then to talk about pollinator pathways are a specific network, really, of people in their own towns, a mixture of public and private properties that provide native habitat and nutrition free of pesticides for pollinators. And they're just really a tremendous organization that has taken off. So this, it started in Fairfield County, and now is really all over Connecticut. And I'm sure this list is from last summer. This list is far out of date. There are just more and more towns, and really people are organizing this on a town by town basis, and then connecting together their pathways from one town to the next. And so land trusts, garden clubs, municipalities, all kinds of people are involved in this. Churches, I should say, and other religious groups, given who the audience is, for this is. So it's a wonderful organization, and I'm hopeful that you guys will go out and join and help plant pollinator habitat. I've mentioned the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation. This is a wonderful organization that's produced a huge amount of information about pollinator conservation, and refined it for different parts of the country. So they have regional pollinator conservation resources. I work for the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. On my own website, I have talks and handouts from multiple pollinator habitat conferences that I've run. I have all kinds of information about my work with looking at pesticides and honeybees. And so what can you do to help our bees? Reduce or eliminate the use of insecticides and fungicides, and restrict herbicides to carefully targeted applications. Plant, as I've said, a diversity of flowering trees and shrubs and perennials through the whole growing season. Get rid of your lawn if you can. Leave natural areas for nesting and overwintering habitat. If you're a beekeeper, you have to manage your mites and work with your community. So this is my contact information. And then I wanted to show a slide about World Bee Day, which is coming up on Wednesday. So this is an opportunity. I'll just leave this slide up here. This is an opportunity for you to connect with people who love bees around the world.
Thank you. Oh, sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead.
And I'll answer questions. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. And actually, so I wanted to give people a little bit more background on the pollinator pathway movement from what I've understood, because I've now attended a couple different things that have talked about it, is that it really, as Kim said, it started in Fairfield County, and really it built town by town, and really began with people forming a steering committee to discuss creating a pollinator pathway, and then actually going to the town and getting a map of the town properties and trying to connect different large sort of natural spaces. So it could be, a park or a farm or a land trust. Many of the land trusts have gotten involved, and then plotting sort of along those between those different spaces, seeing what the roads are and who lives there, and are there businesses or religious communities or people, and contacting those folks and saying, we're starting a pollinator pathway and you happen to be on it, you have this opportunity. And so to really educate people along that line, and a couple of the tenets were, as Kim said, to plant native plants, to not use pesticides, and to plant enough flowers so that the 3 flowers or 3 bushes, shrubs are flowering at any given time, spring, summer, fall. And that information is actually on the pollinator-pathway.org. They have a lovely handout that you can look at to sort of figure out what you would like to plant, to make sure you always have something for the pollinators. So it's, and it, as Kim said, it's really growing, it's exploded. And it's a lot of fun. It's a great way to collaborate with your neighbors. what was happening before COVID-19 is that I know there were some kickoff events started because once you get your plan in place and you have your sort of your uh, strategy set, then you have a kickoff event and you invite the media and you tell everyone you're doing a pollinator pathway. Unfortunately, that usually happens in the spring, and so everything has been postponed in terms of actually doing promotion. But I believe the pathways are at least getting planted in places like Madison and that sort of thing. So that's a little bit more of that information. And the pollinator-pathway.org is a great resource for that. And I'm being very specific about the pollinator-pathway because there, I believe, is a pollinator-pathway.org that goes to a totally different organization in Seattle. So the one that you're looking for is pollinator-pathway.org. And Rachel Thomas, who is a missionary with the Episcopal Diocese, is very interested in doing this in southeastern Connecticut. So if you are interested, she put her email up in the chat, I believe, and it's yeah. And I'll send her email out to everyone along with handouts. So if you're interested in southeastern Connecticut, I live in Preston. I'm very interested in this as well. Let me see if Q&A.
Yeah,
Oh, here's a good. So here's a good question. So any advice to engage golf course greenskeepers and groundsmen? This is the trickiest thing. I mean, as far as I can tell, golf courses use so many pesticides. And I will actually say, one of the things that I've learned is that if you plant a native plant, please don't use pesticides because it's kind of tricking the pollinators. Because the native bees and the pollinators will come to the native plants, and if there's a pesticide on it, then you've tricked them and they're going to get sick. So if you someone who's insisted on using pesticides, then plant something non-native because they won't come to it. But however, that sounds like the generalists would come to it regardless, correct, Kim?
Yeah, so yeah, I
It's
think
just pesticides are bad. Try not
yeah.
to use them.
So and it's very difficult. I in my extensive biography, I didn't mention that I was involved in the NOFA Organic Land Care Committee for a number of years and helped to write the standards. And we talked to some golf courses, and it's just really hard for golf courses. The only really organic golf courses we could find were ones where they planned it as being organic from the start. There are golf courses that limit their use, that don't use pesticides on sort of the edges of the golf course, the rough. Yeah, I think from what they would tell me, to manage greens without pesticides is apparently really hard. So it's hard.
That is
Golf courses are a
unfortunate.
difficult issue. Yeah.
It really is. Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So, oh wait, I know someone else had a question. I have to find it. Oh, here we go. Oh, so the town of Stonington has just joined the Pollinator Pathway movement. That's awesome. And oh, so Connecticut Agriculture Station Bee Specialist spoke at our Conservation Commission forum. He studies bees. He said not insecticides, but the mites on the bees are what kill them. What's your answer for that?
So, so he specifically, I think he's talking about Mark Creighton, who's the bee inspector, who's the apiary inspector, who's specifically talking about honeybees. And so it is true that for honeybees, in general, the biggest problem is this mite and the viruses that this mite carries. So that's true. But it's also true that if you use insecticides, without using them carefully to avoid poisoning the honeybees, you can certainly poison honeybees as well.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, so he's talking very specifically about, so it's like COVID-19, if you were talking right now about COVID-19, not to get political or anything, but if you were talking about COVID-19 versus the flu, you would say COVID-19 is the biggest problem right now. It's this big pandemic and it's really killing lots of people. Whereas the flu, is a problem and it kills people on a regular basis. But, right now, the big issue for honeybees is still this pandemic with this mite.
Okay. All right. Okay, so it is 8:33. This recording will be available. I'm going to put it up on the YouTube channel. I'll send the link out when that's up. I'll follow up with folks though with the resources and whatnot. And again, if you are someone who is interested in starting a pollinator pathway in your town, reach out to me, and I will I'll create some sort of document where we can kind of get you in touch with people in your town, because that's really how it sort of starts. It starts on in a town by town basis, and there are many that are started. You may find that there's already one going in your town, and you can jump on. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Kim.
Okay.
We really appreciate it, and we will see you all soon.
Okay.
All right.
Sure.